This video is brought to you by AudioQuest, makers of the Dragonfly range of USB DACs. Click to AudioQuest.com for more information.
So last week we made a video about the KEF LSX2, and that video was made mainly because you people asked for it. It was a video made on the back of viewer demand, and this video is also like that. This video is made on the back of viewer demand from you. And today we're going to be talking about the Bowers & Wilkins PX8 active noise cancelling headphones, which sell for €699. So the most obvious comparative starting point for the PX8 is Bowers & Wilkins' cheaper active noise cancelling Bluetooth headphone, the Px7 S2, which retails for €429. And I'm going to call it the PX7 moving forwards because saying Px7 S2 is a bit of a mouthful when you're saying it a lot. So the PX8 is the same size as the Px7 S2, and at 320 grams, it's about 15, 16, 17 grams maybe heavier than the PX7. And if you put the PX8 next to the PX7, you'll see that on the back of each ear cup, there's the same button layout. So I'm not going to go over that again today. Neither am I going to go over the music app that Bowers & Wilkins supplies, the accompanying smartphone app for the PX8. It's the same that we use for the PX7. If you want to see all the Px7 S2 details, and you need to see my video about that and how that compares to the Sony WH-1000XM5, and I'll put a link in the description box below. The PX8 has a slightly, I believe, amended microphone array compared to the PX7. And I think that maybe the PX8 is slightly better with active noise cancellation than the Px7 S2. Maybe. I couldn't swear on it. I still think the Sony is better than the PX8 with active noise cancellation when it comes to busy streets, but in a more sort of stable environment. And by stable, I don't mean, I don't know, emotionally stable. I mean sonically stable, right? So where there aren't too many sudden loud bursts of noise, it's hard to separate the PX8 from the PX7 from the Sony. The industrial design on the PX8 is pretty much the same as the PX7, but the materials are not. So on the PX8, we get an aluminium skeleton and aluminium structured ear cups. On the PX7, those were made of composite, which is essentially, I think, plastic. So there's a real step up in terms of just how luxurious I think the PX8 look. And the PX7, we're no slouch in that department. They look great, but you pick up the PX8 and you go, wow, that's another step up again. So too with the materials used that cover the headband and the outside of the ear cup, and then obviously the ear pad. That's all Nappa leather. I don't know what Nappa leather is, but I do know that it's extremely soft, which for me makes the PX8 just a bit more comfortable to wear for longer periods than the Px7 S2. That surprised me actually, because the cushioning is pretty much the same, but just that softer leather, it just feels so nice. It feels really nice to touch as well. At the business end of these headphones, the PX8 has a different driver to the PX7. In the PX7, there's a driver made of biocellulose, which I think is like a papery kind of substance. But in the PX8, it's a new driver from Bowers & Wilkins for headphones, and it's made of carbon fibre. And I think this is probably the key reason why, well, it's almost certainly the key reason why, to me, the PX8 sound a lot cleaner, a lot, I guess, yeah, more transparent. They offer greater clarity than the Px7 S2. But no, that audible difference, it is not night and day, or any such nonsense that gets written on forums. I would say that the difference sound-wise between the PX7 and the PX8 is what we would call an audiophile difference. So that will matter to people who are really obsessive about sound quality, like me, probably like some of you, but not all of you. So if you're more of a sort of an everyday kind of audio consumer, you might not sweat the differences between the PX7 S2 and the PX8 as much as me or some other people watching this video. Last Friday was Black Friday, and that means another round of record store day releases around the world. I picked up this David Bowie EP, and I bought this for one track, one key track, which is, and I'll have to read it out from the back here, it is the Hello Steve Reich mix by James Murphy for the DFA, and that's of the track Love Is Lost. Now, I would say that this is possibly one of the greatest David Bowie remixes ever. And it's possibly one of my favourite remixes of all time. If you don't know who James Murphy is, well, James Murphy is the main man behind LCD Sound System. And DFA is his kind of, I think it's still his label. And there are a whole bunch of DFA remixes available that have been done down the years. But the one of David Bowie, it's this epic 10-minute mix. And the clever thing about it is that there's these little sort of keyboard motifs that slowly develop throughout the mix that eventually form into a little hint of Ashes to Ashes. So let's get more specific about what we get sonically from the PX8 that we get less of from the PX7. And I'll underscore two, maybe three things. I mean, the first thing we should remind ourselves of is that the PX7 and also the PX8 are fairly bass-intensive headphones. But I think that the PX8 gives us more dynamic punch, so more dynamic reflex. And that's especially noticeable, not just in the bass, but in the smaller sounds, the micro dynamics, the sort of flickering sounds. So that to me was quite noticeable, especially on that James Murphy remix of David Bowie. And then I went back to a track that I recommended 6 months ago by Girls in Airports called Fables. And what that track told me was that the PX8's top end shimmers far more beautifully and obviously as well than the PX7 S2. Do I think the PX8 are worth the extra 200 and something euros over and above the PX7? It's a tricky one. Sound quality wise, I'm not necessarily convinced. But in terms of build quality and materials and overall look and feel of the headphone, yeah, I kind of am. But really, if you're strapped for cash and it's going to be a real reach for you to go for the PX8, I would probably just settle for the PX7. And I don't mean settle as in like it's a significantly lesser headphone, because it really isn't. It's terrific. Our next comparison hones in on the Apple AirPods Max, which sell in Europe for around 649 euros, so not far off the PX8's asking price. And we've got drilling. I don't know why we've got drilling. Just wait for it to stop. So the drilling stopped. The Bowers & Wilkins, I think, are a little bit more transparent than the Apples, but not by much. And maybe on a different day, I would call it the other way around. But I do think the Bowers beat the Apple on dynamic punch and drive. And the PX8 don't have Apple's sort of mid-bass dip. And I think Apple tend to prefer emphasizing the sub-bass. I do think that the sub-bass on the Apple is a bit more pendulous. It just swings a bit more. Whereas with the Bowers & Wilkins PX8, it's a bit tighter and it just punches sort of from here rather than from out here. Does that make sense? But I think the most interesting finding in comparing the PX8 to the AirPods Max was that I think the Apple play better, or they sound fuller at lower volumes than the Bowers & Wilkins. I know it's a bit perverse to be showing vinyls inside a video about Bluetooth noise cancelling headphones, but the tracks I'm mentioning here, like the David Bowie, James Murphy remix, that is available on streaming services. So is this next track, although it's only been available for the last few years. I'll show you the album it comes from first of all. The Woodwork Squeaks by Was Not Was. Now this is Was Not Was before they invited us to Walk the Dinosaur back in the 80s. This is way before their sort of novelty hit phase. And there's a track on here that I absolutely adore. Even though I don't love everything on this album, it's a bit too, I guess, soulful for my personal tastes. But there's this track, Wheel Me Out. I think it's, the classic 12-inch version. And I call this mutant disco or mutant dub disco. And for me, it's like the missing link between Talking Heads' The Great Curve and Tom Tom Club's Wordy Rapping Hood. And yes, I know Tom Tom Club is the rhythm section essentially from Talking Heads. So it has that kind of early 80s Afro funk drive to it. But this track is full of like weird samples, vocal samples. I think there's a bit of Sweet Pea Atkinson's vocals in here as well. It's just a very strange sounding disco cut. Anyway, I was using this track a lot when testing, reviewing the Bowers & Wilkins PX8 headphones, and also the Bowie track, also the Girls in Airports track, also some Cigarettes After Sex, which we'll come to later. But now we need to talk about the comparison between the Bowers & Wilkins PX8 and the Focal Bathys. So for me, the Bathys favour a sort of more detailed, more sort of spacious sound. And their bass presence is a little bit more mid-bass enriched than the Bowers & Wilkins. But on that Was Not Was Wheel Me Out track, I don't think the PX8 can match the Focal when it comes to sort of head stage width and size and spaciousness. I think the PX8 gives us a much more intimate sound. It's much more there rather than out here, and I think it punches a little bit harder, but that intimacy is, I think it works really well for that Cigarettes After Sex cut. So yeah, I think the PX8 are great for making music sound more intimate, more present, more there. And even though the PX8 can't match the Focal when it comes to sort of top to bottom transparency, they really give up nothing in terms of refinement. So if you get off on a headphone sound that makes Cigarettes After Sex sound more emotionally intimate, or if you like your DFA remixes, not just the Bowie one, but all of them, really pack a seriously forceful punch in the low end, then you want the Bowers & Wilkins PX8. But if your headphone listening kicks come from a more high pixel count sort of sonic imagery drawn by your headphones, more spacious, more evident layer separation, I guess more detail really. So yeah, these are all the things that for me feed into the cerebral appeal of sound. Then you want the Focal Bathys. What about active noise cancellation differences? Well, there aren't really big differences to be called out here. I would say that the Focal are just as good as the Bowers & Wilkins, but no better, and neither are as good in more unpredictable sonic environments like busy streets. They're not as good as the Sony, but they're just as good if you're sitting in a cafe and there's just the hum of conversation and then just the sound of coffees being made in the distance, and maybe a little bit of cutlery or crockery clatter. Crockery clatter, what a terrible term. But if you have that in your environment, the Focal and the Bowers will deal with it pretty nicely, actually. I think the Bowers is much better at blocking sort of high frequency sounds. It sounds more rolled off to me than the Focal. But I did go out and about last week to go and buy some new vinyls, and I phoned Jana on the way when I was walking up the street. So basically to test the phone call ability of the PX8 and compare them to the Focal. And I think I started with the PX8 and Jana said, it's very clear, very crisp. But when I cut over to the Focal, she's like, oh my God, that's so much better. You sound much more, and this is not her word, this is my word, much more sonorous. She's just like, you sound much more pleasurable to listen to through the focal than through the PX8. Even though, John, I can hear you better through the Bowers & Wilkins, you do sound clearer, but there's that kind of metallic edge to the sort of upper mids from your voice that just becomes a bit irritating or a bit grating over time. So the clarity's there, but it's just not as, she said it's not, I think the word she used was rich, maybe. It's not quite as rich sounding. So anyway, the upshot is that she preferred the sound of my voice through the focals and less so the Bowers & Wilkins. And she also said that she could hear more car noise or street noise with the Bowers & Wilkins in play than the focal. And I thought that was really interesting because obviously I had active noise cancellation on. But if you think that's a clear win for the focal Bathys over the PX8, not so fast, because the focal are heavier. They're 350 grams, I think, or thereabouts. And to me, well, they don't necessarily feel heavier than the Bowers & Wilkins. And the Bowers & Wilkins definitely have the more robust side clamping force. But those Napa leather pads make it a bit more, not tolerable. That's not the right word because I don't have to tolerate the PX8. But it makes it less overt than with the PX7. But anyway, so yeah, the focal don't feel heavier, but they do feel bigger. I still feel much more self-conscious wearing the focal out in the street than I do with the Bowers & Wilkins. And really for me, the sonic difference between the two, even though they have very different flavors, sonically speaking, is not enough for me to go, well, look, I'll just have to live with feeling self-conscious with the focal and having the bigger headphone with the illuminated logo on the side. The PX8 for me are a much more understated, luxury, stylish headphone that don't draw attention to themselves at all. I feel much more comfortable wearing those. So generally speaking, if you ask me which one would I prefer to keep, it's going to be the PX8, even though it doesn't sound as good. And I feel the same way about the Mark Levinson No. 5909. Their ear cups are slightly deeper than the Bowers & Wilkins's. It's maybe like a centimetre or something like that. But it's enough to make me feel like I'm some kind of Cyberman when I'm walking out and about. And I don't feel that way with the PX8. And the Mark Levinson are €999. So quite a bit more expensive than the PX8. Still quite a bit more expensive than the focal. They're not the most expensive Bluetooth headphones on the planet, not at all. But I think the Mark Levinson were really the headphones that sort of kicked the door down for all the other sort of manufacturers to follow suit at this price point. And I spent an afternoon going backwards and forwards with the PX8 and the Mark Levinson, listening to Tom Waits' Blue Valentine, also listening to a compilation of early 90s electronica called Dream Injection. I've featured this in a previous video. And without a doubt for me, the Mark Levinson is the more transparent sounding headphone, especially in the mid-range. It does contrast the PX8 as sounding a little bit muddy or obfuscated or veiled. The Mark Levinson is the clearer sounding headphone. I think it sounds fantastic, but I still wouldn't take it out of the house, because I still feel like a complete dork wearing such big ear-cupped headphones out in the street. This is a me thing. This might not be a you thing. So yeah, know that the Mark Levinson really also, to me, sounds, yeah, it's quite a bit better than the PX8 and a little bit better than the focal. And also it has the ability to be used as a wired, passive, normal, no active circuits headphone. And the other thing that really stood out for me in doing the comparison between the Mark Levinson and the Bowers & Wilkins PX8 was the latter's bigger, bolder, punchier bass, which actually, when you hear it straight after the Mark Levinson, it sounds, yeah, a little bit unnatural. But I know that many people out there, especially many of you who might not be identifying, self-identifying as audiophiles or hi-fi enthusiasts or head-fi people. You might like that. I like that, especially, you know, like if you're on a busy street and you've got the noise cancelling on, having that bit of extra low-end weight, I think, makes the difference to a lot of the electronic music I listen to, a lot of the DFA remixes that I listen to, even the mutant disco of Was Not Was, it makes a difference to that. So if you're averse to kind of that sort of fuller, maybe overplayed bass, you might not like the PX8, but if you do, yeah, if you do like that, then it's going to be right up your street. It's kind of funny, really. Well, not funny, and like in some ways it's kind of predictable that my preferences tend to follow price increases as we move up the price range with Bluetooth active noise cancelling headphones. So if I start with the Sony WH-1000XM5, that range of headphones used to be my favourite noise cancelling model. But I think it's just pipped the post sound-wise by the Bowers & Wilkins Px7 S2. And the Bowers makes the Sony sound a little bit veiled. But then the PX8 makes the PX7 sound a little bit veiled, even though they have a fairly similar house sound with that strong low end. But then if you move over to, or move up to, the Focal Bathys, you get more spaciousness, better layer separation, a slight uptick in transparency, but again, you're paying more. So now we're at like 800 euros, right? And we started out at 400 with the Sony. And then when you step up to the Mark Levinson, you're really kind of, I won't say necessarily at the best sound possible, but certainly one of the best sounds possible from Bluetooth active noise cancelling headphones that I've heard to date. But we do have one more to cover. I'm looking at over there. One more Bluetooth active noise cancelling headphone to cover. Hopefully I'll get to do it this year, but it's a good one. It's a really good one. So I'm going to say no more on that. But yeah, you'll have to wait for that video to find out what it is, how good it is, how much it is. However, if you liked this video and you found it at all useful or informative, we did a lot of comparisons in this video. So if you're thinking, but John, how does it compare to that other headphone? I'm sorry, I really don't know. I gave you as much as I possibly could in this video. I think 3 side-by-side comparisons is quite a lot. I think it's enough, really. So I hope you see that the glass here in this video is half full, not half empty. So if you dig that, please consider subscribing to this channel. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching. So the most obvious comparison, or the most obvious, it has, the PX8 has the same, press button ear cup, no. The PX8 has the same, I can't do it, what can I say, ear cup button layout. The PX8 has the same ear cup button layout oh God. What? And if you put the PX8 next to the PX, and it's made of carbon fiber. Fiber? It was Black Friday, last Friday, and that means another sort of record store round of, and they don't have the, and the other thing that really stood out in the comparison between the Mark Levinson and the PX8 was the Bowers & Wilkins' we got drilling again.